UFC Fight Night Allen versus Curtis 2 just wrapped up. So I wanted to go through, kind of break down the card, talk about some of the biggest moments, and then maybe also shift a little bit over to next week, start talking about UFC 300, which is now 0 cards away. That will be next Saturday. So let's just dive right into the main event here. Honestly, one of the better fights of the year. I don't have like a super strong memory of what the other top fights were, but that was an absolute scrap between Brendan Allen and Chris Curtis. Brendan Allen gets the nod with a split decision. Now, personally, I think it was a very close decision. I scored rounds 2, 3, and 5 for Curtis, and I also think he had an argument for round 4. It seems like it's pretty split, almost like 50% of people think Brendan Allen won, 50% of people thought Chris Curtis won. Interestingly enough, for the 5th round, all 3 judges scored it for Brendan Allen. So it seemed like that last 15 seconds where Chris Curtis was like noticeably hurt, it seems like that was the difference maker. Now, I get right if the judges thought that Brendan Allen injured Chris Curtis, hurt him, whatever it was. I understand giving him that part, but even if they thought he hurt him, I feel like Chris Curtis was dominant through the first like 4 minutes and 45 seconds of that round. So I still think even if they thought Brendan Allen hurt Chris Curtis, I still think he had a decent argument to win that round. But like I said, very close fight, absolute scrap between those two. Shout out to Chris Curtis for taking that fight on short notice, and then shout out to Brendan Allen for accepting that fight. I think a lot of times only the guy who takes the fight on short notice, the new guy, gets credit. But I mean, Brendan Allen was supposed to be fighting up in the rankings against Marvin Vettori, or at least right near the same rank. Now he's taking a short notice fight on an opponent that is objectively a bad stylistic matchup for him, and is someone who's beat him in the past. There's not a ton of gain there for Brendan Allen. He took the fight. He gets the nod, so shout out to both of those dudes, both absolute warriors. Brendan Allen afterwards called for a title shot. We all know that's not going to happen. It's going to be DDP taking on Adesanya, and then that Robert Whittaker Khamzat Chimaev fight is very likely going to be the number one contender. So looking at some of the options for Brendan Allen moving forward, I think the Sean Strickland rematch is interesting. Strickland seems to be like wanting a title shot or bust. He went from, talking about how the title's worthless to like saying I'm fighting for the title or I'm going to boxing. But I think he's going to fight again, obviously. And you pretty much have like Jared Cannonier or Sean Strickland. Those seem to be the two options. It's not a great spot to be in right now if you're Brendan Allen, because if you beat Sean Strickland, you're beating the number one contender, at least in terms of the rankings, but you're probably still not going to get the title shot. So maybe he takes some time off, kind of heals, see how the Whittaker Hamzat fight shakes out, see if that guy's going to get the winner of Adesanya DDP, and then maybe he books a fight. But I'd have to imagine his next fight's going to be up in the rankings, either with Sean Strickland or Jared Cannonier. Some people might, want to see the Marvin Vettori fight rebooked. Personally, I don't. I think in these situations where you have a fight canceled and the fighter who's healthy takes another fight and wins, I think it's kind of odd, unless they're already jumping way up in the rankings. I think it's odd to rebook the fight because then it just seems like it was pointless, right? Like, what does Brendan Allen get out of this win if he's just stepping right into the same matchup with Marvin Vettori, especially when he wasn't going to be taking a huge jump in the rankings? So I don't think anyone was super excited about that fight. I think we want to see Brendan Allen continue to fight up in the rankings. So Strickland or Cannonier, I think, makes sense. And then for Chris Curtis, I really don't think his stock goes down at all. I think if anything, it goes up. On short notice, this was a super impressive performance. And I mean, he pretty much looked great up until like the final 15 seconds where it seemed like he tore his hamstring. Hopefully he recovers quickly. Not sure what the timetable on that's going to be. And we get him back in there. Maybe down at 170. I think it's just so interesting because he's pretty consistently undersized at 185. He's fought at 170 in the past. We saw like him and Joaquin Buckley fight up at 185, and they both were pretty much the same size. Joaquin Buckley has dropped down to 170, found a lot of success, so I would be interested in seeing that. But if he wants to stay up at 185, just kind of fight these dudes towards the back end of the top 15 or right outside the rankings, I think there are a lot of fun fights out there for Chris Curtis. Now, pivoting over to the co-main event, we had Damon Jackson defeating Alexander Hernandez by split decision. Personally, I thought this was a clear 29-28 for Damon Jackson, with Jackson taking the first 2 rounds, Alexander Hernandez taking the third, where he hurt Damon Jackson really early on in that round. I think one of the judges scored it 30-27 for Hernandez, which seemed crazy to me, but you'll get some of those weird scorecards every once in a while. Good to see Damon Jackson back in the win column. He was coming off of 2 losses, and I feel like he's kind of just right back in that mix in like the fringe top 15 area. He got the top 15 shot against Dan Ige, and then he lost against Billy Q, but Billy Q's another guy who's like right in there, kind of near the rankings. So I think he's going to have a fight probably in like the 16 to 25 area in the featherweight division. I think maybe Nate Landwehr is an interesting fight, but just someone in that kind of area is probably what's going to be next for Damon Jackson. And then for Alexander Hernandez, he's been on a tough run here. He has lost 4 of his last 5. Personally, I think he should go back up to 155 pounds. I get wanting to try at 145 if you feel like you're undersized at 155, but he's 0-3 at 145. He just missed weight in this most recent fight, so it's not even like the weight cut's hard, but he's having success, right? He's not having success, and the weight cut seems to be really tough. And I mean, his last win was against Jim Miller at 155. Jim Miller has looked great, so he's still competitive up at 155. Hopefully he stays up there. At least the cardio looked better, right? I think typically he's a guy who fades. He ended up winning the 3rd round, but still wasn't enough. Then the fight before that, we had Chepe Mariscal beating Morgan Charrier by split decision. This was just a great fight. Very, very close. I think you could have given it to Chepe. You could have given it to Charrier. It was that close, pretty much a toss-up. So not upset either way. I think both these dudes are just going to be super fun fighters to watch moving forward. Then we had Ignacio Bahamondes with a nasty head kick knockout over Christos Giagos. When we include the Contender Series fight, Bahamondes has 4 finishes in the UFC. He had this head kick knockout, he had a Bravo choke, he had a wheel kick knockout, and then he had a front kick knockout. So this dude is just super diverse with his striking, can also mix in some submissions. He's super huge for lightweight. I think he's like 6'3", 75.5-inch reach, only 26 years old. He's going to be someone who is super exciting to watch moving forward and should just continue to develop since he is still pretty young. And then the final fight on the main card, Charlie Campbell taking on Trevor Peek. Charlie Campbell takes that one by unanimous decision. I picked him in my prediction video, so I wasn't too surprised. I just kind of thought he was the better fighter all over the place, and I think he proved that here today. He's looked pretty impressive in his 2 fights in his UFC career. He had the setback on the Contender Series, but he was looking great in that fight before he just kind of ran into, I think it was Chris Duncan's right hand. So he's really bounced back well. I think he's an interesting piece in this division. And then for Trevor Peek, he's just a guy where I want to see him get in dogfights with dudes like pretty much like right on the edge of being in the UFC. Like I want to see him fighting pretty much the lowest level fighters in this division so he can just go out there, have a scrap, do what he does best. I don't need to see him fighting these like up and coming prospects who are actually going to make waves in the UFC. I just don't think it's super entertaining. I don't know if the UFC views Trevor Peek as like a future contender. I don't think we've seen that out of him, but we know he's going to fight like a dog. He's going to get in these scraps, and that's just what I want to see out of him moving forward. I believe he's still 2-2 in the UFC, so no risk of getting cut or anything. He's always going to be must-watch television when he's out there. And then shifting over to the prelims, we had decision wins for Alex Morono, Lucas Brzeski, Norma Dumont, and Victor Hugo. Nothing crazy with those matchups. And then we had 3 straight finishes to start off the card. The first one, the buzzer beater submission at the end of round 2 for Gene Matsumoto. His last 3 finishes have been by guillotine, so that's kind of been his go-to submission. This was a super impressive win. He's only 24 years old. He's now 15-0. And to get a submission win over Dan Argueta is very impressive. I think if there was a path for Dan Argueta to win this fight, it would just be to take it to the ground, control Matsumoto. He probably wants to stay standing, but he tried to force the grappling. Matsumoto made him pay, put him out with that guillotine, so good win for him. Definitely a future contender in this division. And then we have Cesar Almeida knocking out Dylan Budka with nasty elbows out of the clinch, put him out. And then we had Nora Cornell with a nasty knee to the liver and then followed it up with a few head kicks, but it was really the knee to the liver that just dropped her opponent. She was done after that. So overall, pretty fun card. I think it ended, with that great main event. Never great when you have 3 straight split decisions in the last 3 fights of the night, but I don't think people are going to be too upset. Remember, close fights are not robberies. I thought Chris Curtis won on my scorecard, but I don't think it's a robbery. It was super competitive. Both guys put up a great fight. So that's going to wrap it up for this one. UFC 300 next Saturday. Super hyped for that. Going to be putting out a ton of videos throughout the week talking about that fight card. So stay tuned for all of those. Thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.